Hi everyone. Welcome back to the AIM Collective Conversations webinar series. I'm Leah Marshall. I'm a research assistant with the AIM Collective and a student in Dr. Joanne Lefebvre's math lab at Carleton University. I'll be hosting today and making sure the webinar runs smoothly. Today we have Dr. Hanna Wickstrom, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Education at Lakehead University. She received her PhD in developmental psychology and education from the Dr. Eric Jackman Institute of Child Study at the Ontario University for Studies in the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education through the University of Toronto, quite a mouthful, in 2023. She's particularly interested in early years education and classroom-based research. She specializes in play-based learning, and her research addresses how educators can support critical foundational mathematics skills through teacher-facilitated play. She is also an experienced primary education classroom teacher. Hanna was kind enough to share her talk on play-based learning and math development from the Canadian Early Mathematics Education Conference. Everyone is welcome to ask questions. Just raise your virtual hand or post in the chat and we will get to you. This Zoom call is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Let's have a great discussion, and I'll get us started with the first question for Hanna. So Hanna, you gave this talk a few years ago now. Is there anything you would have said differently if you gave the talk now?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I'm definitely going to answer that in a moment, but I just want to say hi to everyone. Thank you for spending the beginning of your evening with me. It's nice that we have a group here where we hopefully have time and space to ask questions. So to answer your question, actually, Leah, yeah, there's a lot I would like to add on. My type A teacher brain wanted to make slides to help answer this question. Do you mind if I start sharing my screen?
Of course.
Thanks. Oh, I'm going to have to send a request. We'll just do a little tech support in the meantime. I'll try again.
Should be ready to go.
Yeah, we're good to go. All right. This is my very exciting gray background. My husband says, most people put photos of their loved ones on their desktop, to which I say, I love you very much, but I like a minimal background. All right. So maybe I'll just kind of start with like a really quick refresher of some of the key ideas I talked about in that recording. Thank you very much for watching it. In that recording, I used a main framework that describes play as a continuum. This is a framework that was developed by Dr. Angela Pyle and Dr. Erica Daniels at the University of Toronto. I love this framework. I absolutely still use this framework. So I want to review it before I kind of dive into a bit more detail that helps to build upon what was talked about in that recording that you watched. So big picture here, this framework describes play as a continuum that ranges in level of child and educator control or direction over the play. It involves broadly three main types of play that I'm just going to use to help simplify our conversation a bit today. The first type of play is what we call free play. This is often what we think about when we think of children at play. This is play that's entirely directed by the child. The child's choosing all the choices. The educator really is not getting involved. They're standing out of the way, being more of a passive observer of the play. When it comes to early math learning, we might see children, for example, playing with blocks, building during free play time. On the other side of this continuum is what is referred to as teacher-directed play. This is play, as the name suggests, that is directed or led by the educator. It has a really particular goal in mind with really particular steps that need to be followed to achieve that goal, all of which was determined by the educator. It's still playful and fun, but there's not as much room for child choice within this type of play. Often we like to think of things like board games or card games when it comes to understanding teacher-directed play. In the middle here, this is what becomes a little bit trickier to kind of wrap our heads around and to understand what that looks like in practice. But the third type of play is called guided play. This is play that is to some degree mutually directed by both the child and the educator. Uh, for example, here, the educator actually joined the child during free play. They had turned their drama center into a grocery store, and the educator joined as a participant, decided to be a customer at their store, brought in their flyer, was asking them questions about the cost of different items and so on. The research is showing us over and over and over again that guided play is largely considered to be the sweet spot for the early mathematical learning of young children. This is where children learn and retain the most novel math knowledge. In these studies, they also draw a really clear distinction between free play and guided play, and they highlight that when children learn through free play alone, they learn very little new math knowledge. So we see statistically significantly greater gains in learning through these guided or teacher-facilitated approaches to play. Okay, so what are we really seeing in practice and what has really kind of evolved since the time I gave this recorded lecture about 4 years ago now? Well, in practice, we're really good at doing the ends of this continuum. We're really good at understanding and implementing free play and understanding and implementing guided play. But what's hard is to move everything a bit more towards the middle. How are educators actually supposed to go about doing guided play? This is what the research tells us we should be doing, but there are some challenges in practice. And that's really the question that I got to explore in my dissertation, which I would say is the biggest change from the time I gave that talk to now, hence why I'm showing you the slides, because that dissertation is done. I've answered those questions. I've been able to publish some findings. So I'd like to kind of share some of the key findings from that work with you right now. I think that will be perhaps the best way of enriching the talk and the recording that you saw. So what I did in my study is I was able to work with truly exceptional educators to find out how they were successfully facilitating guided play to support the early math learning of kindergarten children. And what I did is I stole all their very best ideas and I'm going to share them with you today. So thank you very much to our participating educators. What I was able to find in this work is that educators use three overall approaches towards guiding children's play, all of which range in level of who initiates and extends the play. The first main approach is something that I called extending. This is when play is created by the child, but then extended by an educator towards particular mathematical goals. For example, here, the children were engaged in free play in the drama center. They're playing dress up. They had created a restaurant. The educator observed them in that opportunity and that period of free play and identified opportunities to extend the play towards particular math learning to support particular math goals in that playful context. Teachers describe a whole number of strategies to do this, often by offering different materials to support and extend the math learning, such as offering like a toy cash register and toy money, or different manipulatives to help them frame their mathematical thinking. They also often comment on the math learning that's happening in the play. In the kindergarten document, this is often referred to as noticing and naming the learning. So that might be something like the teacher would say, "Oh, Timmy, you made such a tall tower. I think that tower is even taller than you." Or, "Oh, what a beautiful A-B pattern you made there with your paint," helping to draw their attention to math features within their play that might have otherwise gone unnoticed without that adult intervention and support. The next thing that they do is they join play as a participant, as I kind of previously described already. They use a lot of questioning, asking children questions in the context of play to help assess their learning, to get a deeper understanding of what children know, and to challenge and push their mathematical thinking further. The next main approach that educators use to guide play is something that I called facilitating. This is when educators are really working kind of hand in hand as equal partners with children in playful contexts. Often, children's goals for play far exceed their capabilities. So they just need help from an educator to make their ideas kind of come to light. For example, this is my friend's child. She wasn't in the research study, but they got a new refrigerator. And of course, that comes with a giant box, which is super fun. And Hazel wanted to turn it into a spaceship. But she needed help to do that, right? She needed help to like physically build it, to cut through that thick construction paper, to know where to put the door and how to make the door like big enough for her to actually fit through and use it like a spaceship. So she needed the adult support to highlight the math learning and to kind of facilitate those spatial reasoning skills that are needed to make this project come to life. Educators talked a lot about facilitating or co-directing classroom inquiries. This is a big component of the kindergarten document, following inquiry-based learning, following the students' interests, but doing that in a way that is still guiding them towards accurate and engaging math learning. In this case, they were really interested in paper airplanes. So they learned all different ways to build airplanes. They wanted to see how far they could fly them. So this wonderful, brave teacher let that happen in her classroom. Airplanes are flying everywhere. And she taught them a lesson on measurement, measuring how far those airplanes could go using series of standard and non-standardized units there. As you can see with those linking cubes or links and that measuring stick or meter stick, I think. The last approach is what I called inviting. This is where educators create a playful context and then invite the child to join them in that context and allow them to kind of extend it in whatever way that child might choose to do that. The most common way is through provocations. We see this a lot in our kindergarten classrooms. It's a big part of how this document is interpreted and implemented. Provocations involve setting out different tasks, sometimes thought of as centers, that can have an open-ended goal, like providing beads with a 10 frame and asking them to sort it. Although we do find that obviously children might not engage in the activity in the way that you intended that they would. That's okay. We can talk about that in a moment, perhaps. And sometimes these provocations can be a bit more closed-ended, where there's a really particular task that the educator wants the child to do. In this case, they provided scales with a variety of materials, and they wanted them to balance the scale. Importantly, what all the educators talked about was the need to support children's academic learning, particularly their math learning, before and after periods of play, and connecting those opportunities. So before play, allowing children to be intentional about what they want to do in their periods of play by planning for play. For example, asking children to draw a blueprint of their building before they go off and draw it, looking at kind of 3D or a bit more spatial reasoning skills before they go off and complete that. And then after play, coming together as a class to debrief what happened, to consolidate their learning and highlight key ideas that happened during those periods of play. Often this was done by sharing documentation of what happened in periods of play, such as photos or videos of the students at play, highlighting the math learning, answering any questions or misunderstandings that might have come up throughout these playful contexts, using it as a time to celebrate the learning of young children, and importantly, using it to plan for future periods of play, thereby making guided play in their classrooms an ongoing and iterative process. If you are curious to learn more about these findings on guided play that helps to extend upon what was discussed in that video, I encourage you to scan this QR code. It'll bring you to a copy of this full article on the paper if you'd like to learn more. That's my TED Talk response to your first question, Leah.
That was awesome. Thank you, Hannah.
No problem.
Now we can take questions if anyone else has any. Well, I have one.
Go ahead.
So you had mentioned that sometimes kids don't engage with the materials for play the way you want them to. How do you handle that situation?
Yes. I think that is to be expected, and that's also to be okay. Um, part, I would say big picture, math has to be part of more of a comprehensive program in a classroom, and you should be providing children with multiple opportunities to engage in mathematical thinking through a variety of ways. That can be through the provocation, and if that provocation didn't go the way that you wanted, that's fine. That child probably took it in a different direction. There was still meaningful learning in that direction, even though it might not have gotten to the math goal that you wanted. I think it's important as an educator, though, to know that and to be real, to say, okay, that was fun. That provocation didn't do what I thought it would do. No math learning happened. Now I need to think of a new way to approach this math objective that we still need to make sure that children are learning in our classroom. Mhm. Hi, Joanne, go ahead.
Hi, Hannah. I'm going to ask what is either a really easy or a really hard.
Those are the best ones.
Yeah. Um, we did read your paper, not that one, but another earlier one, or in our reading group earlier in the week.
Ah,
And I was interested to see that you never defined play anywhere. And, and I mean, I could go with what I sort of think play is, or I could ask you, the expert, to tell me, how do I know when something is play and when it's not?
Joanne, that's such a good question. Are you ready for a 18-week course on answering that?
No, I want a nice short answer.
Okay, let's begin by putting some parameters on this. I will talk about play in the context of an educational setting. How is play being used as pedagogy, as an instructional approach? Does that help to define it a bit more?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, when we're looking at play as pedagogy used by educators in an educational setting, that could be in early childcare spaces, but most often we see it in kindergarten spaces. I should clarify, we see play in all of these spaces, but the purpose of play is very different. Like I talked about in the recording, there can be very different perspectives regarding what the role of play is. Is it for social learning? Is it for academic? Is it for both? I will talk about it in terms of defining it as pedagogy in a kindergarten setting because we are looking at play to focus on both social and academic learning. And viewing it like that is really a substantial kind of cognitive shift from traditional ways of viewing play. Within that way of looking at it, I will refer back to the play continuum because I think it helps to provide multiple entry points into understanding what play is in that context. So, what is it? I would say it ranges. It's anything that involves something that is entirely child led and playful to something that is more teacher led or highly structured. It can feel a little bit ambiguous. I understand there's some ambiguity there because um, sometimes play can feel like a bit relative. Like, is a child playing outside play? I would say yes. Is a child playing with a board game in a classroom play? I would say yes as well, because there is learning that is happening in those multiple contexts. That's a wide-ranging answer. Would you like me to further clarify?
Yeah, well, maybe I can, obviously I'm not a kindergarten teacher and I never have, but I would assume that there are some things that kindergarten teachers need to have children learn that make it hard to be playful, right? And so I guess that's what I was wondering. Is it from the kid's point of view that this is something fun and therefore it counts as play, or is there some more objective way of saying how play engages children differently than non-play?
In non-play?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And I would say that it actually involves the perspectives of both these individuals involved. It involves a perspective of what's playful and relevant to the children, and also what's playful and relevant and learning for the educator. And it's that difficulty of finding kind of a dance between both of these perspectives.
Okay. I'll have
One
to.
thing that might further complicate my answer, but perhaps could open up conversation for other ideas, is that often we create this kind of false dichotomy between play and direct instruction or more explicit instruction, and that what we do in a kindergarten classroom has to be one or the other. And I just don't think it needs to be that case. We know there are benefits to both of these approaches, and there's space for both of these in a classroom, and children benefit from both of these approaches. So, something I'd be very interested in learning more about in the future is finding ways where we can bridge both of these things together in a way that really leverages the benefits of both things that are playful and perhaps not so playful. Hi, Ashley, I see your hand up.
Hi, thanks. I love what you just said at the end too, finding that um, where the two might meet. Anyway, that's not my question. My
Okay.
question, sorry. My question is, and I'm not sure if you delved into this part, but was there anything for those educators that you were in the classrooms with them? Were there any common structures or ways that they structured their day or their math block that maybe was similar and was working to allow this play and the before and after and stuff to happen?
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to give you a broad answer. For my dissertation, it happened in COVID, so I was not able to see videos of them doing it. But I will give you my professional opinion from my work as a supply teacher. I work in school boards as a supply teacher. I've been in hundreds and hundreds of kindergarten classrooms. And so while I don't have the same depth of experience that comes with having my own classroom anymore, I have the opportunity to see the breadth of how this document is interpreted and implemented, which might actually be able to answer your question perhaps in a better way. In the classrooms that I've been in that have very successful math programs, I do see a lot of similarities. One is that we know the time of day for students to be learning can impact. Most school boards have what's called a balance schedule. I don't know if your school board does this, where it's 3 blocks. Yeah, block one, 100 minutes, and a break, then a 100-minute block, then a break, then a 100-minute block. Almost always the first block is literacy, right? That often is prioritized in practice, and that's great. Love math, I love literacy too. I'm not going to argue that. But often the second block is math. If we push math learning to later in the day, the children aren't as fresh. They aren't really as ready to engage with these challenging tasks we're asking them to do. After that position of being in the second block of the day, they've just gone outside to play, they've had a snack, they're still ready to go. I would say there's a lot of commonalities. It starts and ends as a group. So they'll be on the whole carpet. They'll do a focused math lesson. Sometimes it's teacher created, sometimes it's from a math resource. Then they dismiss the children off to play. Typically, what happens, I've seen different versions of dismissal off to play. Typically, it goes, you sit as a whole group and we do an explicit instruction lesson. You go do centers, or what might be referred to as table jobs, that are really targeted playful activities, that teacher-directed type of play, which reinforce the concept that was taught in that whole group lesson. And then from there, they get free choice and free play. When they're in free play, the teacher circulates as much as possible, because we know they're busy, to engage in those guided play opportunities and to take documentation, to assess, to extend play, all those lovely things, before coming back together at the end for, I would say, no more than 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to debrief before they transition off to the next thing, which is probably, getting ready for recess or nutrition break. Did that answer your question?
It did, and that's what I sort of imagined in my brain. Again, I've done planning time for kindergarten, and so I've never run my own kindergarten classroom, but that's how I think I would do it. And then I think I would also, and I don't know if you saw this, you can tell me if you did, have like small group direct, very targeted small group time at that same time that they're doing like the tabletop stuff.
Absolutely. So this is really common. We often call this withdrawal from play. So the whole class, for example, might be at the tabletop, or they might be at free play at the same time. The educator will have what I'm going to call leveled grouping. We can use a different term if we like, but essentially they have a small group lesson they want to do with particular students for a particular reason. They call them over. It's always the horseshoe table. I don't know why it's always the horseshoe table, but they pull them over to that red table. They do an activity for about 5-10 minutes. They send them back out, and then they pull over a new group. I find that can be a very effective method as well, particularly if you're a teacher or teachers that are more comfortable with structure, and they like to have a plan to be able to anticipate what's going to come. I understand that the open-ended nature of play can be kind of overwhelming sometimes for educators. So approaching play from more of that structured side can be very, very helpful. I see that a lot. To be fair, I also see teachers who kind of approach it the opposite way, where they start by letting the children engage in free play, and then it becomes more structured after that point. I don't see it as much, but I think it's important to also highlight a different format or a different way of going about it. I still see your hand up. Do you have follow-up questions? Just a Zoom.
No,
Yeah, no
that's
problem.
me. Not Zoom. Sorry.
No worries. Great question. Thank you, Ashley. Hi, Shuyan. Sorry, can you help me pronounce your name properly?
It's Shuyan.
Shuyan. Thank you, Shuyan. What is your question? How can I help you?
Thank you so much for sharing your interesting research line on continuum of play. I wonder, have you noticed any difference in children's learning or teachers' practice between playing with concrete materials and like playing video games or do some math activities on the iPad like nowadays kids would do?
That is such a good question. I don't know any data to answer that directly, but I want to be fair because sometimes I think we can get like nervous about tech to say like, oh, it's not as good. We need to have that hand-on tactile component, which like absolutely those concrete materials, that tactile learning can be really, really beneficial. I would say that it kind of depends on what is the goal of the learning or what is the math learning you want the children to be engaging with. Because I think there's different benefits to both approaches. For example, with the tech stuff, have you heard of Prodigy? It's a math game. It's pretty popular in schools. It's often for older children, perhaps not so much in kindergarten. But something that's wonderful about that game is A, high level of engagement. The students want to do it. B, there is instant feedback. Kids know if they've gotten it's basically focused on like fluency skills, arithmetic skills, or number sense. I think it's wonderful that students can get immediate feedback, or yes or no, I got that answer right. It also collects tracking data, assessment data about how the kids are doing. So that's a really effective assessment tool for the educator that they can use layered with other assessments, but that gives them valuable information about how that child is engaging with the tech. So I wouldn't necessarily say that like concrete versus tech, one is better than the other. I would say there's benefits to both, and it's about how you're using it and perhaps like what tech you are using. Great
Thank you,
question.
Anna.
You're welcome. Mhm.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, or actually, first I'll ask,
Yeah,
putting out a call, a general call.
Can I ask a question?
of course.
Um, Sorry, I just listened to your talk and I can't turn on my video because I'm driving. So,
That's okay.
um, yes, uh, I want to follow up with the question of the conceptual question about play and related to game and gamification that you just referred to for the answer to answer Juan's question. I wonder if because when it comes to the conceptual differentiation between play and game, the literature it's a bit gray in that area. Um, the association for the what's that TASP, the Association for the Study of Play, which
Yes.
now has come to the 50th year, I think, of its anniversary. Um, 2 years ago, when I attended to present my paper, it was about scientific and everyday concepts in kindergarten or preschool education, moving from everyday concept to scientific concept through play.
Mm-hmm.
They, they were maybe that is a more traditional, perspective, but they made a distinction between play and game, and then the gamification of learning, and then they were a bit resistant to consider any type of activity which doesn't start from or initiate, which is not initiated by the child as play.
Yeah.
But on the contrary, gamification, which comes from more teacher and educators' side, they wanted to call this more gamified learning rather than playful learning. So I wonder if you touched upon that area of literature in your dissertation or other places. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I must admit, I did not touch the area of gamification within my dissertation. As a field, play and gamification, we're really big on defining it in our own ways, and there's not a lot of consistency, and sometimes there's a lot of tension and what something should be versus should not be. But I think I want to pick up on one main idea. You're talking about your time at the TASP conference and how there was some resistance to consider anything that was not child-led to be play. That's that's very common, and there's a big reason for that because there's so much traditional research that really kind of protects this view of play needing to be child-led. Something that has really helped me shift my practice or shift my understanding, or perhaps broaden up my understanding of play, which could include gamification, is to switch the focus away from play that needs to be child-led to practices that are child-centered. What is developmentally appropriate? What is in the best interest of the child? What makes learning authentic, meaningful, and beneficial for the learner? In this case, a child is often what we think about when we talk about play. In this view of focusing on child-centered practices, play doesn't need to be led by the child in order to benefit the child. So I would say a similar thing can be true for gamification. As long as it is still child-centered, if it is developmentally appropriate for the age group engaging in that game, then I think it can still be beneficial without necessarily needing to be led by the student. I hope
Thank you.
that answers your question. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Oh, yes, Joanne, I'm sure.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just come back to not exactly the same thing that I was asking you before, Hannah, but
Come back to it, no problem.
well, but maybe from a different angle slightly. And I guess this
Okay.
is from my interest as a researcher, right? If I'm engaging with children to try and understand what they're thinking or what they're doing or what they get out of something, we would very often say to a child, "Oh, will you play a game with us?" Now, these are probably the most boring games in the world, right? Because they're things that experimenters have designed to try and elicit some very specific information from the kid. And yeah, I'm sure, Hannah, you've read a lot of papers, you know the kind of thing that I mean. So is that a problem? Like, do the children themselves kind of go, oh, this is stupid. This is another ridiculous adult thing to do again? Or are they kind of, I mean, my assumption has always been, and I think this is probably true for a lot of us, that everything you do with children, it should be fun and interesting for them if you want them to behave the way, if you want them to do what you want to do, right?
Yeah.
But is it a problem if we call something a game that isn't or that we imply to them that we're going to play with them, right? We're going to do some playing. Is that a problem? I mean, does it matter how adults use this word with children?
That's a very good question. Okay, there is a particular study that I think could answer this question for you. And I'm trying to recall the main outcomes of the study, and I can't right now, but I will send you the paper. It's a
Okay.
study that looks at play from the perspective of children. So how do children define play? And they were able to outline a few factors that children use to identify something as playful as not. Could you imagine coding that data from children, transcribing those interviews? Ooh, that grad student need to be paid like triple time. But they were able to identify a few variables, and I think some of the variables were things like enjoyment or joyful, like they enjoy doing it, which is broad, right? Because kids enjoy so much or don't, depending on the kid. I think there was something about an element of choice and perhaps an element of it being like playful, hands-on and playful. In terms of your own research, I don't think it's a problem to say like, hey, we want to play a game. I think that can spark interest and perhaps some buy-in. And I think particularly when researching with children, there's such an inherent power imbalance between an adult and a kid. So any way that you can introduce content that is familiar and accessible to a child, I think is a great way of conducting research with them. And so doing things through a mode of play, I think is a nice way of not eliminating, but perhaps minimizing that power imbalance a bit more and making those research contexts a bit more child-friendly.
Right. Because I mean, obviously we would want it to be child friendly.
Yeah.
That would be the goal.
That would be the goal. We want them to,
We want to. Okay. I'll think about that a bit more. But yeah, if you could send me that paper, I'd be
I
very
can send you that paper. There's also one thing we've been doing in our labs, not our labs, Angela Pyle gets the credit for this. I got to be a grad student on this project, but we brought in assent procedures for children in participating in research. And on this note about providing them with familiar materials, we explained the process of research to them through a storybook. And it was pictures of like the actual researcher using the actual tools. Like we walk around with an iPad, the big weird mic on it, and we're in their classroom. So it was photos of us walking through the actions of what we were going to be doing with the kid and writing the instructions for participation through that book in very child-centered and friendly language. And before we began a research activity with them, we read them the book, which ended with like, we were asking them to play games with us. They weren't games, they were literacy assessments. And we ended the book by saying, do you want to go play some games with us? And they would say yes and come with us, or they'd say like, nope, and go back to their classroom. So I can also send you a paper on that as well, which might help to unpack that a bit more. Thanks. Hi, Wendy.
Hi. So, coming from my perspective, what I'm always thinking about is, how do I get teachers to change their practice? And so, I can see talking about the continuum and guided play, and I think teachers could see that and understand that. But I think it is going to be very hard to shift teachers away from the benefits of social learning to academic learning. And just any thoughts, anything that you've seen that teachers go, oh, aha, that's important to me, to my kids, anything like that?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. I'll tell you three things. From the research, we know that one of the biggest factors to shift teacher practice is evidence that what you're asking them to do benefits their students. And often that requires time for them to do the thing, to see the outcome, and then believe in the outcome. In particular, to play in math, one thing that my teachers talked about in my study, but that was true across all of them, was that it required them to engage in learning of both curriculum, but not just curriculum, like content knowledge of math. Like, what are the math skills? What do those look like? What do those look like over time? Really having that deep, like, subject matter knowledge. And then also having knowledge of pedagogy. How am I supposed to do that? What does play look like? What are different strategies? And they needed to have both of these things in their brain at the same time to see the connections between them. When they knew curriculum and more broadly math content, then they could see the math learning in the play, and then they could see how the play could lead to math learning. But without that subject matter knowledge, it was really hard to connect these two things. But it's a broad idea to say, and I know it's kind of hard because bottom line, it's saying, okay, teachers, you need to go off and learn two new things. That learning doesn't need to be painful. That learning, like the teachers have so much of that already. Sometimes they just need small tweaks in conceptualizing it or being given a different resource that they haven't seen before, which presents the same idea, but a similar idea, but in a different way. For example, the play continuum can present play that used to be viewed as only free play as now so much more. And it just opens up the opportunities for teachers to understand that pedagogical knowledge and that subject matter knowledge and to blend those two things together. We ask so much of our teachers, right? It never ends.
I know, and my background is science, and so it comes from a very inquiry perspective, and so yeah, just wondering how we're going to do similar things that we've done with teachers in grade 6 and grade 3 when we go to kindergarten. Anyways, thanks.
Oh, good. Maybe I'll add one more thing. It's kind of obvious, but allowing educators choice and space to use their professional judgment, I think, is really important. It doesn't really help if we say, like, you have to do it this way. And for many good reasons, I'll say that won't work in my classroom for like XYZ, because you don't know my students, you don't know the space I'm in, all these reasons, which are totally valid and appropriate. So providing options, providing choice, and then space to let them interpret it and implement it in a way that works for them based upon their context.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with a final question to Hannah. Hannah, if there's one thing you could have educators take away from this session and your talk, what would that be?
One thing, just one. I think
Or a small list.
a small list, maybe I'll cheat and do two. My first one, I think, would be that play is a continuum. It's so much more than just free play. It involves it involves collaboration, it involves teacher involvement in the play. Okay, I'm gonna do three things. Two, teacher facilitation of math learning is so important. Children are not going to learn new math skills if they're just left to their own devices in free play. It's not going to happen. Why would we expect that to be the case? It might be child-centered and super friendly and super fun, but they need a more knowledgeable other to introduce, scaffold, and extend new math learning. And I think with that goes to my third point of play and direct instruction are not mutually exclusive. You can use both of them in your classroom. You're a good teacher if you use both. They can be used together. They can be used to complement each other, and they don't need to be in competition with each other.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us, Hannah, and everyone else.
Oh, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for the conversation.